Hello everyone, and welcome to the Data Input and Output lecture. Pandas as a library has the ability to read data and write data to a wide variety of sources. For this lecture, we're going to be concerned with just four main data sources: CSV files, Excel files, HTML from the web, and SQL. In order to work with HTML files and SQL databases with Pandas, you'll need to install four libraries. The instructions are in the notebook, or if you just want to do it quickly, these are the four libraries you need to install: SQL Alchemy, LXML, HTML5lib, and then the beautiful Soup4 library. You can do this either with pip or conda. Alright, once you've installed these libraries and reference a notebook, you're ready to get started. Let's go ahead and jump to the Jupyter Notebook and show you how to read and write files with Pandas. Alright, here we are at the Jupyter Notebook. Keep in mind that as we reference the files, such as the example CSV file and the example Excel file, you'll need to make sure they're in the same location as your Jupyter Notebook is. In order to check the location of your Jupyter Notebook, you can just go in a cell and type pwd, do Shift Enter, and it will report back the location. This is the same file location the example CSV file and the example Excel file should be in. If you've downloaded the entire repository of notebooks and are working in the Data Input and Output section or notebook, you should be fine by just referencing the files as if they're already there. Okay, let's go ahead and show how to open and read CSV files. In order to do this, you can just say pd.read_CSV, and then begin typing out the name of your CSV file. In this case, I know it's called example, so as I start typing this out, a nice trick is to click Tab, and it will autocomplete the file name. In your case, you may just have example, not example.csv. Let's go ahead and read that in. I did Shift Enter, and now I can see the CSV file as a data frame, with the columns A, B, C, and D, and 0, 1, 2, 3 as the rows. Note that if I want to read any files, I just use the read underscore command, and I can click Tab here, and I get this drop-down menu of the variety of formats that Pandas can read from. So Pandas can read from even your clipboard, CSV, Excel files, HDF files, JSON, pickles, SQL files, tables, etc. Just keep that in mind that you have a lot of options here. Right now we're just going over the most common ones. Okay, in order to write to a CSV file, you're going to need a data frame. So I'm going to go ahead and just say df is equal to pd.read_CSV. And again, I'm just going to do example, tab autocomplete here. And now I have df as that same example df. So I've actually saved it to a variable. Off of a data frame, you can say to underscore. And if you click tab here, you'll notice now you have a variety of formats that you can write to. It's basically almost all the same formats that you could read from. So I'm going to go ahead and say df underscore to CSV. I'm going to label this my underscore output. And the other thing I'm going to do is say index equals false. And the reason for that is because I don't actually want to save this index as a column. Let me go ahead and show you what happens if I don't put index is equal to false and I just put df to CSV. I'm going to go ahead and say pd.read_CSV, and I'm going to read the file I just saved, my output. Note I get this column here called unnamed 0, and that was the old index. Now if I say df to CSV and set index false and run that cell, and then if I read my output again, then I won't actually save that index and I will automatically assign a range index to the data frame. Keep that in mind as you're saving your CSV files, whether or not it's appropriate for you to say index equals false. Alright, now let's go ahead and move on to reading and writing from Excel files. Pandas can read and write Excel files, but you should keep in mind that Pandas can only import the data. It can't import formulas or images or things like macros. Using that with the read underscore Excel method may cause Pandas to crash. Another thing to note is that you may get an error asking you to install the XLRD library. That should have been automatically installed if you use the Anaconda distribution, but if you did not, you'll go ahead and go to your terminal, and in your terminal or command line, you'll type conda install XLRD, or you'll do the same thing with a pip install. Again, you're not going to do this in a cell, you will actually do this at the command line or terminal. But hopefully if you did the Anaconda distribution, this should have automatically installed along with pandas. Let's go ahead and see how this works. I'm going to go ahead and show you the Excel file I'll be working with. Here I have a very simple Excel sample. In fact, it looks almost the same as the .csv file we were working with, except here it's denoted that it's in sheet 1. And basically what pandas thinks a workbook is that a workbook is just a bunch of sheets, and each sheet is a data frame. Meaning I can say pd.read Excel. I pass in the Excel file name, the xlsx file. A good trick for this is to begin typing the file name, press tab, and select it. Again, this only works if the Excel file is in the same location as this notebook. If it's not, you'll need to pass in the whole file path. And then you can say sheet name, and then pass in sheet 1. We'll go ahead and read this, and we get the output we expected. And that's basically it for reading from an Excel file. You pass in the file, and then you pass in the sheet name you want, and Pandas tries its best to read it in as a data frame. Writing a data frame to an Excel output is also a very simple process. You just take the data frame you want to write to Excel, say to_Excel, pass in the name of the Excel file you want to save it to. Let's go ahead and make a new one called Excel sample2.xlsx, and then we can also specify a sheet name if you want to. Something to note is that when you're saying to_Excel, for whatever reason, Pandas, you need to write in sheet_name and then the name of the sheet. We'll go ahead and put in new sheet. Alright, let's go ahead and run this, and that's it. We've saved it to an Excel file. Now let's go ahead and move along to working with HTML. Again, you'll need to install quite a few libraries in order for this to work, and you'll probably need to restart the Jupyter Notebook after that. You can go ahead and check out the notes for this lecture, the notebook for it, to get a list of all the libraries you need to install, or go ahead and go to the beginning of this lecture where we showed the list of libraries. Let's talk about HTML input. Here, I have a link to the fdic.gov failed bank list page, and here's just a list of all the failed banks by the FDIC as far as them keeping track. It's the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and here we have a bunch of failed banks, the closing date, updated date, etc. But this is basically just an HTML link. This link is in the notebook, so you can go ahead and copy and paste it from there. I'm going to go ahead and copy this link and try to read it in with Pandas. In order to do this, all I have to do is say pd, well, let's go ahead and make, say, data equals pd dot read HTML, and then as a string I'm going to pass in that actual HTML link. It'll take a little bit of time to read it, but it should work out if you have all the libraries. Okay, looks like it worked out. Something to note here is that usually this isn't going to directly relate to a data frame. If I check out what data is, if I say type, you'll notice that it's actually a list. And essentially what Pandas tried to do was to find every table element that was in this HTML file. And if you're familiar with HTML, you know that if you can right-click here and view page source, you'll have this list of actual HTML code. And if you're familiar with HTML, you'll know that you can actually look for, just like there's list classes here, there's actually table references. So there's table markings in here in the HTML code. And that's basically what Pandas is going to do, and it's going to make a list of them and convert each item in that list into a data frame. And what you're going to do is just cycle through that list until you find what you wanted to look for. In this case, it should be the very first item in the list. So if we say data at point 0, so the very first item in that list, that's the data frame we were looking for. Bank name, city, updated date, etc. Let's go ahead and just check out the head of that data frame. And that's what this looks like. Again, some things don't copy over exactly. You get a bunch of null values, but keep in mind, Pandas is basically just reading this HTML file as best as it can. Alright, that's HTML, which is essentially just web scraping with Pandas. Let's finally move along to our last topic, which is working with SQL. Now there's quite a few notes in your notebook regarding SQL and Pandas. Pandas isn't actually probably the best way to read a SQL database, because there are many flavors of SQL engines, such as PostgreSQL, MySQL, SQLite, etc. What we're going to do here is just actually build a very simple SQL engine that's going to be just temporarily held in memory in order to show you how you can use pandas to read tables completely as data frames. However, I would recommend that you actually do a search for a specific driver dependent on your specific SQL engine. For example, if you go to the notebook for this lecture, you'll see that if you're using PostgreSQL, you should actually use a library called psychopg2, which is specifically designed to work with PostgreSQL. Or if you're using MySQL, you should use PyMySQL, another library specifically designed for that specific flavor of SQL. Right now, we're just going to do a very simple example of how pandas could read in an entire table in SQL if it had to. What you'd end up doing is saying from SQL alchemy import create engine. And this is going to just allow us to create a very simple SQL engine in memory. I'm going to go ahead and say engine is equal to create underscore engine. And here I'm just going to type in SQLite 3 forward slashes and then memory colon. So I have SQLite colon 3 forward slashes colon memory colon. I'm going to go ahead and run that. And this little thing, this little line of code has created a very temporary, very small SQLite engine database that's running in memory. I'm going to go ahead and take my data frame, that df, and I'm going to say to underscore SQL, and I'm going to write it to that very temporary engine that we have running in memory. So what you're going to do is you're going to say to SQL, you're going to pass in what you want this table to be called. So we'll go ahead and call this my table. And then you pass in the SQL engine you're working with. In this case, it's just an engine. Now, this engine is going to be a connection usually. I would recommend you read through this documentation thoroughly, but again, like I mentioned earlier, pandas just by itself probably isn't the best source for you to actually read SQL into pandas directly. You should probably look for specialized Python libraries for whatever version of SQL you're working with. But as far as a very simple setting, you can just say df to SQL, pass in the new table name you want, and then the connection to your SQL engine. And now I'm going to go ahead and say SQLdf and actually read back that table. So I'm going to say pd read underscore SQL. I pass in the name of my table. In this case, it's my table. And then I specify the actual connection I want. So con, and that's just the engine, that very small SQLite database that's happening in memory. And if I go ahead and read that and check out what that looks like, I get SQLdf, and notice that an index is a new column here. All right, go ahead and feel free to post to the Q&A forums if you're having trouble finding a particular library that works with your SQL engine or your flavor of SQL. As far as this lecture, the main thing to get out of it is how to read and write to CSV files, because we're only going to be working with CSV files for the rest of the course. As far as your own personal usage, hopefully you can just check out the read underscore methods. There are a lot of them, and you can just look at the documentation or reference the notebook for how to actually read to a pandas data frame. All right. Thanks everyone. Go ahead and ask any questions you have on this lecture to the Q&A forum, because there's a lot of options here and we just don't have time to cover them all. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them in the forums. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture.